All right. So as you can see, I've got some topics we can talk about, but I do at the core of it, I'd love to answer your questions. So as we're going through something and you have a question about what we're talking about, just raise your hand, and because other people probably have that question. And so if it's related to what we're talking about, great. If it's not and you just thought of it, like people may have that same kind of question too. So let's just, while I have some things I'm happy to talk about, I'm much more interested in answering your questions about legal issues. So I'm John Rubelid, and I'm with a law firm here in Phoenix. And a couple of my associates are in the back row. They promised not to heckle. So, so just give you a little background on me so you know where I'm coming from. I grew up mostly in Colorado, Nebraska. So I'm a Midwest country boy. And just, God got a hold of my life after I'd quit college 3 times. I went to school, went to Bible school. And then got out of Bible school, and I thought, I just want to know more how to study the Bible. So I went to seminary, not knowing what I was going to do with my life. But I thought, well, I just get a doctorate and teach. And while I was trying to, make sure my grade point average was up and starting to memorize French, German, besides Hebrew, I had a professor come who had a law degree and a theology degree, and I thought, that's what I want. So I asked my wife where she wanted to live the rest of her life. She said Minnesota. So I went to the University of Minnesota Law School, and then that's the only time we lived there, because then I got a job with a law firm in Washington, D.C. that was at the time kind of the premier law firm representing religious ministries. And so it just kind of, has been a great way for me to combine my passion for ministry with the skills that a law degree require. And so I've been representing religious ministries, churches for about 30 years. And so it's just an opportunity to serve, to be a tent maker. That's where I come. So my wife and I live about an hour west of Lincoln, Nebraska now. I come down here as needed. And we have 8 kids. A number of them live around us, and so we have Sunday dinner every Sunday is at our house with a lot of grandkids, so it's fun. All right, so the goal today is kind of just talk about what are some current things that are going on that you may be facing or you may face, and then, like I said, let's just make sure we get your questions answered the best we can. Okay. There we go. Got to go the right direction. So just let me tell you this. Historically, everybody's been like, well, we got to make sure that we don't, the IRS is really concerned about what we're doing. We got to make sure we got to follow the IRS. And while that's always true, the nature of oversight of churches and ministries and what are called 501c3, charitable organizations, nonprofits, the nature of oversight is shifting. And it's shifting in this way. One is the IRS has no resources and is really struggling to even operate, right? There's currently over 8 million tax returns from 2021 that they haven't even assigned yet, right? So in the exempt organizations oversight, they're really lacking in resources. And so as a result, what's happened is that more of the oversight responsibilities is shifting to the states. And so your state attorney general and a group that are called state charity officials are increasing their oversight of nonprofits in their state, including churches. And so that's where some of the attention is shifting. And so they're building resources and attention. And they're mostly what's called complaint driven, right? It's like a donor gives money to your ministry and you don't use it the way they think you should, then under consumer protection laws, they file a complaint with the Attorney General. And so I was able to be part of a meeting this fall in November with the National Association of Attorney Generals, and they have a combined fall meeting with the National Association of State Charity Officials. And one of the really fascinating things that I learned was, as they are talking about what are, what are the complaints we're dealing with, and how are we processing those? Every example they gave, the first thing that they do in every situation, thank you, is that they say, give us the corporate documents and give us everything on your website and what you're saying about what you're doing, and do those match up? Is your corporate purposes, the reason you have tax exempt status, the reason you represent you exist, and your mission statement, do those align? And increasingly, I get situations where there's a nonprofit ministry that says that we are formed, our corporate purposes are to operate a youth camp during the summers in Fairhaven, Minnesota or something, right? But over the years, they're now doing, women's ministries, they started a church, so now they're doing a number of things. And so when these don't match up, then these activities are acting outside of your corporate purposes and your legal authority. And so you want to make sure that those things are consistent across the board. So, what are your historical statements about who you are versus present reality? Because when you represent to a donor, this is what we're going to do with your money. But your corporate documents and what you've adopted and what your board says isn't giving you the authority to do that, right? Then the Attorney General says you're acting outside your corporate authority, you're making representations to consumers and donors that you don't have the right to do. So it's just a very good, let's check that, right? Let's make sure that you're consistent across the board so you're on good legal authority for what you're doing. That was a really good lesson. And you may need to amend documents to expand your corporate purposes or activities, right? All right, so one of the things that the pandemic has increased is the number of churches or ministries that are now live streaming, right? Anybody in here wasn't live streaming before COVID, but then started? Right. So that creates some potential legal issues. For example, consent, right? So when you're taping somebody, when you're recording somebody, right, do you have their consent, right? So speakers, guest speakers, musician, artist, right, special events that you're live streaming, right, you're recording that, and here's what the Attorney General says, you're recording that, you're putting it up on your website, and that is drawing people to give to your church or your ministry. So you want to make sure that, you need to legally make sure that you have the consent of anybody that you're recording or is participating in activity. Yes?
So does that include guest preachers?
Yes.
So is there a form that they sign?
So you can do a form, but I feel like you can make it even less of a barrier than that. I think that even just in an email, right? Hey, thanks for coming. Look forward to having you ministering in our church. Just let you know that we are recording it. It's going to be live streamed. We recorded it, and so you're coming. You're consenting that we can do that. So it's in an email, and then you ask. Then they're responding. So I think that's a good enough legal trail that you have their consent. Now, if it's something more than that, like if you're bringing in somebody that you're paying to come and speak, like at a banquet, maybe you're doing a fundraising, I would probably do something on their agreement that includes a written consent. Yes, sir?
What about congregation members that happen to be in the live stream?
Yes, that's right here, privacy. Great question. Because, everybody has a right to privacy, and the law is built on what's called an expectation of privacy. Do you have an expectation of privacy when you're in church and you're singing, like, I love to sing. I sure don't want anybody streaming that, okay? Right? But not just that, right? There's other issues like, what about kids? Like, kids getting, like, there's just some, we're talking about this, there's just some really bad actors, right? And so you want to be very concerned about privacy. So the legal issue is, what have you created in terms of expectation of privacy? Secondly is, how have you respected people's privacy? So the expectation of privacy, I recommend that you take that away. In other words, in your bulletin, you can have, this is being live streamed, and so, we have cameras that are videoing this and sharing it. Maybe a sign, right, in the foyer or foyer, I don't know how you say that, right? Or in the church, right, that is being live streamed. So maybe some of you may have a PowerPoint where you're showing announcements at the beginning, just tell people this is being live streamed. So you take away that expectation of privacy. But at the same time, you need to respect people's privacy, right? If I come to your church, please don't stream me singing, okay? My wife, yes, but not me, right? So respect that privacy. Don't have your cameras, panning, that kind of thing. That makes sense? Or after, when the service is over, turn it off. Turn off the stream so you don't catch, we have kids that, as soon as it's over, they'll go up and wave at the camera, that kind of thing. So you want to respect that privacy, okay? So the issue of consent is important. Important as you are working with a speaker, whoever is up on stage or at the podium. Privacy, you want to deal with the privacy issues, remove expectation of privacy. And then the third one is copyright, right? So it's a couple of things about this. One is it's your standard CCLI. How many of you have CCLI licenses? Your standard CCLI license does not provide you the rights to stream the congregation singing, right? Those are actually separate rights. They're under performance rights that you can get. You just need to upgrade your license, okay? So, or there are, the public domain ones, those kind of things you can, so I would work with your CCLI license and get those rights in order to stream the actual music and performance. Okay, copyright, just for the fun of it, copyright is actually what's called a bundle of rights. It's not just one, right? So there's a bundle of basically 5 rights, and so the right to duplicate, to reproduce or duplicate something, the right to do sequels, right? Build on that material, do something else. There's performance rights, so it's a bundle of rights, and so your standard CCLI license is only giving you certain rights that allow you to use the music in your church, right? But it doesn't but the standard license doesn't give you the right to perform that in something like a live stream. Okay. All right. So I think that's been an area that, as you've started, I want to say everybody, but look how many of you raised the hands that said we started streaming because of COVID. I think that's kind of a current issue that you want to pay attention to and address in this way. Hey, let me say this before I answer your question. Right? If you want a copy of my PowerPoint, I'll get your email address and I'll email it to you. Okay? Afterwards. Yes, ma'am.
That's what I was going to ask.
Okay, yes. So you don't have to furious take as many notes, right? Okay, the third thing that we're talking about is a remote worker policy, right? Obviously, some of you at some point probably closed the church office. How many of you closed the church office? Yeah, for some period of time. And so then you were working remote. And then what happens to a number of churches and ministries is then some people continue to work remote, either on a part-time or full-time basis. And there's actually some legal issues that you want to think through about that. You want to manage kind of compliance, risk, performance of somebody who's working remote. Right? I have a number of ministries that are, they used to hire somebody to do all like creative work and design and slides and that kind of thing, and they realize they can hire that out to somebody who may live in another state that used to go to their church, but now they figured out how they do it remotely, right? So you may have somebody who continues to work remote. So, there's things like you want to make sure that person has a workplace that is equipped and is really productive. Because at the core, right, you have a stewardship responsibility. And someone working at home, and you're still paying them their salary, is not so they can not have daycare. Right? Let's be honest about that. And that can be hard to manage. Because, like, if anything else, we are very giving. Like, we want to serve them. We want them to be with their family. Like, all those kind of things. But at the same time, you have to balance that with your stewardship responsibility, that these are funds that people gave to the church to do ministry that you're paying this person with. Okay? Right? You know the tension I'm talking about. So you want to make sure that they have equipment, a workplace, right? And sometimes some organizations say you have to have a dedicated workspace, right? You can't just spread on the kitchen table. Although, my wife would like me to get off the island sometimes, right? Because I just kind of spread out. Yes, sir?
How much different are our responsibilities to a volunteer than they are to somebody who's being paid?
Right. Very different, right? Very different, particularly when it comes to the stewardship, the funding, the oversight, the potential liability they may create. But at the same time, you want them to be set up for success, right? You want them to have a positive experience and actually be doing something that benefits the ministry. So you may need to give them resources, right? Does the person really have the laptop or the access to internet? Do they have quality enough internet to stay connected on a regular basis?
So does OSHA, if they're an employee working remotely, does OSHA?
OSHA applies.
Spreads to their home?
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yes. The other thing is you want to make sure that there's good workflow and communication, right? It's like, what are your expectations about how they communicate with you? Okay? Like, the number one thing that I've experienced damages relationships within an organization is unmet expectations. I didn't know you expected me to do that. Or I thought I was going to get to do this. I thought my job involved, that's a communication issue, right? And so a remote worker policy sets and creates shared expectations. We expect you to when you get online, right? We want to do a Zoom, right? Every other day. We want you to, so what are those expectations? Communication. There's some really good tools out there. How many of you use Slack? Right? So write that down. Those of you right? Slack, right? It's an app, right? And so I live in Lincoln, Nebraska. Nick and Alana are here in Phoenix. And so this little kind of a chat communication tool, if I need to share something with Nick, I just put it in Slack. And it's like messaging or texting, but it's very organized. I can search it, I can attach documents, I can have a conversation with Nick on his own, or I can have a conversation with Nick, Alana, Kathy Ann in a group, right? So anyway, that has nothing to do with law, except, right, good communication really helps to manage that relationship and make them effective, right? Process, supervision, feedback. How do you expect to review their performance, right? What's the basis on that? When somebody's working remote, it's much more on their productivity. Are they getting the job done? than necessarily did they show up in the office, I saw them at their desk, right? That kind of thing. And so that's actually can be a healthy thing, right? When it's like, are they, as long as you get your job done, right? That's kind of the attitude. So, but that whole thing of creating shared expectations, and that's true of anything that a ministry does, right? In terms of expectations, shared expectations minimize risk and frustration, and it's frustration that can often result in a claim against you. Okay, remote worker bra. All right, bonus. When you give me your email address, I have a sample remote worker policy. If you want a copy of that, just say policy, we're remote worker policy, please, or something like that. Okay, attention to governance, right? So here's one of the things about that COVID has done, right? How many of you, your board, met more times during COVID than ever before, right? Like, that was kind of what was true of most ministries or Christian schools, or like, are we going to mask, get a vaccine? Are we going to have school? Is it in person? How are we going to do it online? You know, and then, you know, all these things required increased number of committee and board meetings. Like, the number of decisions that had to be made over the last 2 years, right, was exponential compared to any other time, right? It's just like stress-inducing. Just, we got to have another call. We got to have another meeting. What's your schedule? How do we set up this? Right. So there's been this period of incessant leadership decisions, right? Now, one of the things that I'm really challenging organizations to do is say, okay, now you had all these meetings, right? Like, now it's like, look at your bylaws. Did you hold all those meetings according to your bylaws? Are your bylaws really working for you? Because just like the other matter we talked about, if you hold a meeting and it's not consistent with your bylaws, then you're acting outside your corporate authority, and that decision could be null and void, right? When I started with this firm in Washington, D.C., the senior partner told me the story. He was an undergrad at the University of Virginia. His roommate was in the law school at the University of Virginia. And at the time, this would have been in the 70s, there was a YMCA in Charlottesville, Virginia, right? But the board was deciding to close the YMCA, which at that time still was, the C meant something, right? And so the board was going to close the YMCA, sell the facility, very valuable facility, and give it to another nonprofit that wasn't faith related. And they opposed that. And they said, let's see how we can stop this from happening. And so they filed a claim, and this is true under most states. You can file a claim in your, this was a district court. And based on this lawsuit, they got access to all the corporate records, and coming to find out that not a single director on the YMCA had been elected according to the bylaws. So the court removed all those directors and installed their directors. So there's still a YMCA in Charlottesville, Virginia, right? That can happen to your church and ministry. You get a disgruntled person, someone you asked to leave, someone who's a donor, someone whose child they think was mistreated in your Sunday school or camp or something like that, right? So you want to make sure that the way you're operating is consistent with your bylaws, which may require you to change your bylaws. But let's do it, right? Let's be consistent so you're acting according to your corporate authority. You want it to reflect your manner of decision making, right? Bylaws review is always a healthy process. Always a healthy process, because you get new board members in, right? And they're like, maybe they didn't read through the bylaws like they should have. But reviewing them, they go, oh, hey, we need to do that. Or this is how this works. Oh, well, this structure doesn't quite fit us. Let's change that, right? So attention to governance is a legal issue, right, that really affects the legal authority of the organization. Okay? Right. Voting by email. Right? How many of your boards vote by email? It's like, send an email, hey, do you think that we should buy this? Do we think that we should, like, and so then everybody responds and they consider it a vote. Guess what? It's not a legally binding vote. Right? And like this shocks a lot of board members. But state law controls this about what is permitted in terms of a meeting. What is a legally binding meeting of a board of directors that is not in person? That's the issue, right? Normally, you would have a meeting, right? We meet on the third Thursday of every month. The board meets and we vote on things. There's an agenda. We have a quorum, right? And it takes a majority vote to decide most things. Some things require a 2/3, right? That's how you normally operate. But when it's not in person, what is a legally binding vote? And there's basically two scenarios. One is you can have, like, as long as you have proper notice and a quorum, a Zoom meeting, a conference call, right? Those are all valid ways to make a legally binding decision. And at the core of it, what the law wants for a charity is for board members to fulfill their fiduciary duties. And one of their fiduciary duties is due care, right? And attention to detail. And so it's that interaction that the law wants among a charity's board members, so that someone says, well, we need to think about this. Well, what about this? And, and I think that this is a better, so it's that interaction that really brings value. And as long as you can accomplish that on a Zoom, so it has to be where all the members hear each other and can provide feedback, that Zoom, that conference call, that Google Hangout, whatever, right, Google Meeting, whatever tool you use, then that's necessary. So that's one way you can have a non-in-person legally binding meeting. The second way is what's called unanimous written consent. And that is, like, let's say all of you, we're all on the same board, okay? Hobby Lobby just gave us $4.5 million to do good with, right? And so we're making a decision. If like the chairperson or a secretary writes up what the resolution is, right? We are going to give $1 million to Concordia, right? School, university, whatever it is. And we send that to each one of you, and each one of you signs it and sends it back. That's unanimous written consent. That's a legally binding decision by the board. Right? Now, in this day and age, right, we could actually put that resolution in an email, send it by DocuSign, all of you electronically sign, and we could get that. You don't all have to sign the same piece of paper, right? But you all have to sign the same resolution. Okay? So that's another way that there's a legally binding decision can be made by the board. Yes?
How do you find out if your state does not permit that?
Well, I'm going to tell you that the only one I've found, I can help you with that. We can look that up. Nevada allows email, but you have to have you have to do it in a way that there's a chain, right? So there's an email train or chain or whatever. People can go back and see all the other comments. Nevada does allow that. Trying to think, is it New York or some Northeast states allows it if your bylaws specifically say it's allowed, right? So there's a couple of states that are like that. Where are you at?
Minnesota.
Yeah, Minnesota. Okay. Moving on. All right, this is an interesting case. How long do I go?
I think it's an hour and a half total,
Okay, awesome.
up to it.
All right, so this is a case that, like, really interesting case, right? trustees of New Life in Christ Church versus City of Fredericksburg. Now understand that the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, right, has what are called the religion clauses. One is that the government cannot establish a religion, right? That was what the founders meant, right? They cannot establish a religion, so the government cannot step in, right, and say and do religious activity. Or I think what the founders originally meant was you couldn't have something like the Church of England, right? The other clause is free exercise, right? So we should have the right to freely exercise our religion, right? And that, like, sometimes those are conflicting, right? Like, I really want to pray in school. Like, the free exercise clause should allow me to do that, right? Or I'm a superintendent of a school and I want to pray, exercise my religion over this group of students. Well, the Establishment Clause, cases have decided you can't do that. So there are these times in which, like, there's this tension between these two clauses, right? Free exercise of religion, you know, it's not like without some kind of boundaries, right? There was a case in the early 90s of Native Americans in the state of Washington being denied the right to actually, I think it was workers' compensation, right, or unemployment. It was unemployment division versus Smith. They were terminated because they were smoking peyote. That's a religious practice, right? But they couldn't. They were terminated, but they couldn't claim unemployment because it violated a neutrally applicable law, right? Right. So this is like con law 101, right, Nick? Right. So there's these two clauses, but at the core of these two clauses, what the Supreme Court has held is that because of those two protections, right, that the government doesn't have a right to interfere in a church's governance based on theology, right, application of their religious practices, right? That's core of it. And so things like defining who is a minister, right? That's a tough one because kind of every, faith practice can be different. And should the government say who a minister is, right? That's a core question. But then when you add tax benefits, the government has that interest to decide who is a minister. So not everybody can get a housing allowance, right? But if your faith practice, you're licensed, ordained, commissioned by, so we're not going to talk about, that's a very tax-heavy kind of thing. But this case is about the church's right to define who is a minister. And so what happened in this case is that Virginia has a real estate tax exemption on ministerial residences. So this church had a college ministry. And that pastor of that college ministry lived in one of these houses, and they filed for an exemption. And the city, their lawyers, looked at the actual manual, the Presbyterian Book of Church Order, and it says that to be a minister, it required ordination. Well, this college pastor was not ordained. So, based on the church's practice and faith, they may not have technically complied with their own book of church order, but the church should have the right to say this person is a minister, he's doing faith practice. In fact, the Supreme Court, prior court decisions, have said that the church defines, right, the church's practice, the church can define who is a minister in, I'm totally confused on my words, who is exercising ministerial duties. And this guy was, teaching, preaching, leading Bible studies, discipling, all these things that were like, that's ministry. right? But because that the city interpreted the church order book, so get it? You have a governmental entity interpreting church doctrine. But the Virginia court denied the real estate tax exemption, and the Supreme Court denied what's called cert. In other words, they didn't grant it to be heard at the Supreme Court. So it's actually a very troubling case, right? Because it has a governmental entity interpreting church faith and practice, right? So, I just pointed that out because that's kind of that's a frustrating case, and we don't want. While you feel that's happening in our country, right? We want a Supreme Court that's going to protect that faith and practice. That's kind of a current court decision, right? Legislative activity, political activity.
Was that before or after Hosanna Tabor?
It was after Hosanna Tabor.
Really?
Yes. Yeah, this was just 2 months ago or something. Legislative activity and political activity. It's so fascinating, right? It's like, I said this to my son about 7 months ago because, we get some tension between our kids on political stuff, right? Like, the first time I'm like, dude, that is so woke. It's like, what are you doing, right? But anyway, but it's kind of between our 8 kids, it's kind of fascinating, right? And so I have these, our thing is this, right? Our thing is Thanksgiving. Every year at Thanksgiving, like, our kids come home for 5 to 7 days. Like, it is a party, right? But I'm always like, I'm going to speak into their lives, right? So the rest of the year, I don't care where you go for Christmas. I don't care where you go for Easter, right? 4th of July, but come home, right? But like Thanksgiving, like, okay, dude, you want to marry my daughter? Like, let's talk Thanksgiving, right? You love Jesus. You go to church. You can take her to church. Like, Thanksgiving. Okay, let's shake on it. Okay, you can marry her, right? So I had this conversation, right? And it's like, this political discussion is like, why is that at the front of everybody's mind? Like, I've never been like that. And my son is like, you can't help it. That's how we've grown up, and our world is like, everything is about politics. And the challenge is that that's true in the church, and the church is prohibited from engaging in political activity. Right? Your tax exemption, you don't pay corporate income tax on your donations or things that you sell, or camper fees or school tuition, right? You don't pay that your school charges, right? You don't pay income tax on that, and under 170, contributions to you are tax deductible, right? So the IRS doesn't get tax on money you get, right? And they don't get to tax the person on that money they give you, so they care a lot about this, right? So, just in this world in which we live in, where there's legislative activity and political activity, right? So I just want to kind of rehearse. Many of you already know this, right? But let's kind of rehearse this, right? Because I think that you have to. I didn't know that moved.
That's kind of cool.
Wow. Now I care. Look at that.
Rasmus Skyline.
It's a video. So actually, that right there is South Dakota. That's a Pine Ridge Reservation. This is a nonprofit I have that's called a White Clay Makerspace. Yeah, I'm going to get sidetracked for a second. This is in White Clay, Nebraska. Has anybody ever heard of White Clay, Nebraska? Where are you from?
A little bit east of you, Lincoln, Nebraska.
Oh, sweet. So White Clay, Nebraska was, the New York Times called it the Skid Row of the Plains. The Economist called it the worst town in the nation. Up until April of 2017, it had 4 liquor stores that sold 3.6 million cans of beer a year, 13,500 a day to people who had no legal place to drink it. This town used to be, the official population is 12, the actual population is 9, but there would be 40, 50 people, mostly Oglala Lakota from the Pine Ridge Reservation. I can throw a rock onto the reservation, and they would be living in the streets. There'd be sex trafficking, prostitution, drugs, all kinds of stuff, right? And so that closed down. This was the largest of the beer stores. It had 3,600 square feet. So we got a grant, bought it, and converted it into a place for artists and crafters. So we have, they can come in. We have quilting machines, sewing machines. We have, a whole store with beads, and we have a leather sewing machine and artist workspace and carpentry and all that kind of stuff. So they can come in and use that, and then we help them sell it online, that kind of thing. So
Well, that's really good.
That is
I
really
liked your
cool.
little sidetrack.
okay,
Yes.
so that's a way. So it's been a great. It's been a journey, right? Because when we bought this building, what happened when the beer stores closed down is the distributors came, took all the beer out. The guy that owns this took the cash out of the machine and left. Right, when I went in there, there was one room that was full of boxes of potato chips, right? And pickles, and and it sat there for 18 months. And soda, right? There was a year's supply of soda. It was just stuff and dirt everywhere, right? And so it was a crazy time. Look at that. Okay. Anyway, all right. So as you know, right, legislative or lobbying activity, right, is permitted. Lobbying activity is defined as support or opposition to legislation, right? Like Lincoln's Freedom Ordinance, right? Or fairness, right? So support or opposition to legislation, right? A 501c3 can do an insubstantial amount of lobbying activity. And what is that? Well, it's somewhere between 5% and 15%, right? That includes volunteer time, right? You can make an 501h election to have it measured by dollars, but you can do an insubstantial amount of lobbying activity, support or opposition to legislation. Political activity is support or opposition to candidates, right? And everybody thinks president, but you know where the hot button is today? School boards, right? So that includes school boards, right? And this is prohibited. Right? If you engage in lobby activity, you can lose your tax-exempt status. Okay? So that's just a really good reminder to think about as we live in a culture, society where it's all about politics. Right? Like, how many of you honked your horns this week? Just kidding. Don't raise your hands. Right? How many of you are truckers? Whatever. So this is a really good reminder to make sure that you're attentive. And the other thing is that you may have people in your church or in your ministry that they don't know this, right? Or you hire them, or they're, right? And so you hire someone who's just out of high school or in college. They live their life in this political world where that's all their friends can talk about, and that's how their friends are decided. Isn't that ugly, right? And they come to work for you, man, they just expect to bring that with them. And they send an email. Or they respond to something. Or maybe they're running your Facebook and they say something, So we have to maintain education of people about how to manage this. Yes, ma'am.
But that is just if they are doing it in their name of, like I work at Christ our Savior Lutheran Church. If I am responding as a representative, official representative of my church where I am employed, Not necessarily if I am doing it on my personal Facebook page or for my personal.
Yes, that's a legal distinction, but sometimes the lines get blurred,
Okay.
right? Particularly when somebody is posting on their Facebook and they're kind of like, in our Bible study, we talked about this, or sometimes those lines get blurred,
Okay.
So I have a quick question too. So hypothetically, does that extend to maybe spouses, like a pastor's wife on her Facebook? And it heats up between church members and the pastor's wife, even though I might be asking too
Is this,
specific.
you're asking for a friend?
It might be a hypothetical thing. I live in Oregon, so there's a lot of
Yeah.
political heat going on. Mask mandates and all the
Yes.
garbage. So that's the only thing that, like you said, Facebook has been. And so I thought, there's been some
Yeah.
social media drama.
Yes.
Does that extend to spouses?
Well, it can, technically, legally, no.
Okay.
But the lines get blurred
Okay.
very quickly. All right. Word to the wise. All right. So this is a case in North Carolina that. So we're going to talk a little bit about religious freedom. See, my pocket is bothering me. So actually, let's go here first. This case is referred to as Bostock v. Clayton County. And this was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was actually a combination of a couple of cases. It was this one, this Bostock one, and then there was one in Ohio that involved a funeral home. And they had terminated somebody because of their sexual orientation, right, gender identity. And as you know, right, there was a big uproar about Equality Act, right? Are we going to allow sexual orientation, gender identity to be a protected class under laws, right? Like race, sex, age, that kind of. And so that, in some states, that's getting adopted. In some cities, that gets adopted, right? But as on a federal level, it hasn't been. But what this case did, it took the already protected class of sex and said, SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, is already protected under sex. So it didn't take a new law. It didn't take a new federal act. It said the term that's been in the Civil Rights Act since 1964 of sex already protects somebody, sexual orientation, gender identity. And sadly, the Supreme Court agreed. Right? Like, I can't imagine in 1964, in fact, I know in 1964, when those legislators, right, adopted it, they did not mean homosexuality. Right? So for, that's a, for many people, many faith, that's very important. So that decision was made in 2020, right? But there were actually a couple of encouraging things in the Bostock case, right? So we're going to make you all we did the First Amendment already, so we're going to continue to make you constitutional scholars, right? And one of the things that the court says in the ruling is, right, none of these considerations, including like how they were interpreting sex, are more important than the straightforward application of the text. That sounds like something your pastor would say, right? So it's basically saying, like, when you go to interpret a statute, right, what's most important in that statute is what's said in that statute. Not what they might have meant, how it could be changed, how cultures change, what are the words behind it. It's like, what does that text say? And to have a Supreme Court say there's nothing more important, right, than the straightforward application of the text, that's actually very helpful because there are still some good religious freedom laws on the books that the text couldn't be clearer. So it's actually very encouraging in many respects, right? And we'll look at Section 702A of the Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act, which says that a religious organization, right, can make faith-based decisions in its hiring. I love that I love the straightforward application of that text, right? The other thing is that looking at Title 7 necessarily covered the plaintiff's claims as well because it's impossible to discriminate against a person for being homeless. So this was the basis of the ruling, is that sex, right? You can't make a decision about homosexuality or transgender without there being a sex element to it. Okay? So this was, at the time, it was a frustrating decision, right? But the court is very clear that there are already other protections in the law that a faith-based organization should be able to rely on because they address the issue of, okay, what's this going to do to churches or religious ministries, right? Well, the court said clearly there's other protections, and they talked about those protections, we'll talk about those in a second, that a faith-based organization should be well protected, right? But like, I'm a slippery slope guy, right? So I'm not as confident as the people writing that text were. Not only that, like, let's just be very clear how this works, right? Essentially, right, law does not drive culture. Culture drives law, right? And so when you have people who have all these cultural beliefs and thoughts, they get elected to the legislature. What kind of laws are they going to make, right? Okay.
So if they're saying that other legal protections exist, are they saying that those trump the Title VII position?
We're going to find out.
Okay.
There's a couple of cases we're going to find out. One is Seattle Union Gospel Mission case. And so that's happening. Not only are we going to find out, we found out in part in this decision. Because this was a Catholic high school. And historically, right, the Catholic high school would say, we're a religious organization protected under Title 7, 702A, as a, right? But a drama teacher was terminated after announcing on Facebook, like, just get off Facebook, right? Announcing that he would marry his partner. So the Catholic high school is like, that's contrary to our belief, right? He's believing something different than us and practicing something different. But the court cited Bostock as a basis for holding for the plaintiff and against the Catholic school. Right? And they said, well, ministerial exception doesn't apply because he had secular job functions. So this was a local case in North Carolina, but it's frustrating, right? Because it's not the direction we want the courts to rule or decide. We want there to be, hold on to these religious freedom protections we've had, okay? Right.
So the distinction there is between a ministerial function and a position that's mostly secular.
Yes. So let's talk about it, because were you the one that said Hosanna? This was after, the other one was after Hosanna?
Somebody asked.
Okay. So Hosanna v. Tabor was a court case that affirmed what's called the ministerial exception, right? And the ministerial exception is not a law, right? It's not in terms of, it's not a statute. It's not something the legislature adopt. It comes out of this First Amendment thing we talked about, Establishment Clause, free exercise of religion. Out of that, it's saying that a church, the government should not interfere in the relationship with a church and its employees, or a religious organization and its employees, those doing ministerial work. So the First Amendment protects those who are involved in ministerial work from employment laws, including pay. And Hosanna Tabor was the first Supreme Court decision or significant federal decision that applied the ministerial exception to somebody who wasn't an ordained licensed commissioned minister or didn't have those functions, right? Our Lady of Guadalupe School applied the ministerial exception to grade school teachers because they had a responsibility for sharing the faith to their students, right? So the question is, how wide can this ministerial exception go, right? That's what we're going to find out. But understand that it's significant because it's not something that can be overturned by the Equality Act, right? Or by changing a statute. It's inherent in the First Amendment. Okay? Are you with me? Tracking, kind of? All right. So, frustrating decision because it applied Bostock in the context where we would normally say it's a religious organization. They have the right to choose who their employees are, and they should be consistent with their faith. Right? That's that slippery slope. I'm afraid Bostock is going to... this is not the first case we're going to have. The Supreme Court is looking at a couple cases. In fact, just before I came here, talking to my friend Sherry at ADF, right? And we just got this email on this Seattle Union Gospel Mission case that the Supreme Court is going to hold and not decide whether they're going to hear it or not, because they're hearing another case with similar issues, right? Seattle Union Gospel Mission case is the mission denied hiring an attorney for their law clinic because of sexual orientation. Right. Oh, Lady Guadalupe. Right.
So Billiard, just to be clear,
Yes.
obviously made the decision that the teacher did not fall under the Hosanna Tabor
Correct.
religious exemption.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
So we lost both. They didn't get it under the religious organization exemption, and they didn't get it under ministerial exception. Had secular job functions. All right. So we're going to get to some practical applications.
So to like protect the ministry, like if Billiard maybe had it in the job description or something, like that talked about the duties, maybe that what they were teaching religion, would that have maybe changed it?
Here, Beth, you want this?
Never mind. I'm sorry if I'm stealing your thunder. I was just
That's exactly where I'm going.
okay. Well, I like it.
Come on up.
No.
Thanks for setting me up. Right? So these are the protections, right, for faith-based hiring. One is, right, 702A, which says a religious organization, can basically discriminate, right? Discriminate is not a bad word. It has a meaning, right? We make discriminating decisions all the time, just not for the wrong reasons, right? So a religious organization can make choices based on their faith, right? But they have to be a religious organization, right? So that, just based on the number of cases, you want to make sure that it's clear in your articles, bylaws, and then in your practice, right? Bona fide occupational qualification, right? Short term for this is BFOQ, right? So you can, quote unquote, discriminate or make decisions on the basis of ethnicity, race, age, and religion as a BFOQ protected by Title VII, right? Good example of this is, let's say I wanted to open a Japanese restaurant, a sushi, right? And I wanted it to be as authentic an experience as you can have. BFOQ could say, I want all my front of house staff to be of Japanese ethnicity. Okay? Right? Otherwise, that would be discrimination, wrong discrimination, but BFOQ allows me to do that. And so that's true of sex, right? So a church or a faith could say that we we only think that men should be in certain roles, right? Well, that could be a BFOQ, right? Or we only think that young men should be the head counselor for the boys at camp, right? This makes sense, right? Or girls in a girls' dormitory, like we're only going to hire a young lady to be the RA, that's the term I was saying, residential assistant, right? Then there are state law equivalents to this, right? And the fourth one is a ministerial exception, okay? Now, right, action steps, right? One is corporate documents, right? Like you say, like we're a church, right? Come on, how could that's got to be clear, right? So, you know, I've looked at documents for Christian camps. Their articles of incorporation had nothing to do with being religious or Christian, right? Like, so let's just make sure that that whoever formed your church back when didn't just grab documents off the state Secretary of State's website, fill them out, right? You want to make sure that it's clear who you are, what you're about, and it's consistent through all your documents. Use of grounds and facilities, right? Public accommodations. That's an important thing to be attentive to, right? Because you want to open your facility to people without and control its use, right? So you've heard about the wedding cases, those kind of things, right? So you know on what basis you can make that decision that's related to why you exist, right? So you may only do weddings for people who go to your church, or maybe have a faith commitment and they've done counseling through your pastor, or you know whatever. You can open it up, but you always want to tie it to why you exist, your corporate purposes and your religious purposes, right? Non-discrimination policies, right? You want to protect your right to select on the basis of religion, right? And you know, for many of you, how many of you, your church organization has an employment manual, handbook, right? So I can't tell you how many of these I've seen where someone's like, well, hey, like this organization sells it, or they have one. Let's just take theirs and copy it and make it our, like, but in that there's a non-discrimination provision that says you're not going to discriminate on the basis of religion. Like, really? Like, you don't want to adopt that policy, because that's, you know, if Alana's representing the other side in court, that's her first, right, piece of evidence is they have this policy that says they're not going to discriminate on religion, and they just did, right? I don't want to be on the other side of a court case from Alana, so just to be clear. And you want to accurately communicate how you make decisions to your employees. Like your application, on your website, in your discussion, in your manual, it should all be very clear. Right? You have to agree with our statement of faith, or you have to have this practice in your life. You know, what are these things that are the basis on which you're going to make a decision that you want religiously protected? Employee conduct issues, right? Clearly communicate, document your standards, right? You can have standards of expectation about how your employees, right, are going to conduct themselves in life, right? But you want to clearly communicate them. All right, so here's this kind of, Beth, this goes to your core of your question. I think this is an important question for you to ask. Could a disgruntled employee deny that he or she had religious duties, or knew what the religious employer, what your church or ministry expected of him or her on and off duty? Like, you have a second grade teacher in your school, and you say, what are your religious duties? And they go, like, I need to be a good example, but I don't teach Bible, I just teach my, no. That's wrong, right? Like, they're a minister of the gospel, right? Like, they're sharing the truth of Jesus Christ by the way they conduct themselves, by the way they talk. They integrate their faith into their subject and how they communicate. Like, that should be their answer. And if that's not their answer, right, I don't know if it's on you, but like, let's take responsibility for that. So that goes, in large part, that goes to the heart of the ministerial exception. Is that person like the second grade teacher in Our Lady of Guadalupe in Montana, who the court said that person had religious duties because that person, it was clearly responsible to communicate the faith and practice of the organization through their classroom to their students, right?
Job descriptions are important.
Job descriptions are key, right? Like, very key. And job descriptions are key, like, that's a whole nother seminar, dude. Like, let's do that one too, right? I don't know what you guys are doing at 12. But position descriptions are not just read when you hire them. Right? It's the basis for hiring, and it's a basis for their conduct, and it's a basis for their review. Like, their employee review should include, like, tell us about how you're integrating faith. Tell us about show us a lesson plan where you talked about how this story in the Bible applied. Like, let's do that, right? So let's build an HR system that consistently communicates and documents the connections between the position and the camps in this situation, right? Or the church's religious mission. Let's have that kind of, right? So that when you ask the question, like, okay, tell me about the religious responsibilities you have in your position. They got it. They know it. They can say it. They repeat it, right? There's no doubt to them that they have those. All right. Step off soapbox, right? All right, so commercial use of church property. And the most common use is when you're renting it, right? So understand that there is related use and unrelated use. Related, the term related means to the reason why you have tax exemption. It's related to your tax exempt charitable, educational, scientific, literary, eleemosynary. What does that mean, right? But it's in the tax code, right? It's related to the purposes on which you have tax exemption from a legal perspective, your religious mission and your faith practices, right? That's related use. Unrelated use is a use that's not related to those purposes. Like, you're just doing it because you can use the money. And it's not about where you spend the money, right? Like, we're renting out our school for X activity, right? We're rented out to the local chamber of commerce, or we're rented out to the local, Chick-fil-A or corporate business to have their meeting at, right? That's not necessarily related. If you can make it related, right, then that's helpful. But unrelated use can bring some challenges. Any use, right, will it affect your property tax exemption? If you start having substantial non-related use, then your county, municipality is going to say, well, hold it, right? Should your property really be tax exempt because you're doing all these rentals and all this other activity that's not related to your purposes? Okay? You may have to pay tax on unrelated business income, right? Public accommodation laws. If you start letting just anybody come and rent and use your facility for any kind of activity, at one point do you become like a hotel or restaurant where you can't say no to somebody? Right? So you want to have a facility use policy about why and how do we make decisions about using our facility. Increased potential of personal injuries, right? If you're starting to use your facilities in ways that aren't related or are outside of what you've done historically, right? Does your insurance policy cover that activity, right? Or you need to increase are you creating different kinds of risk that your insurance policy needs to cover? And then you may need to think if you're doing some kind of entrepreneurial activity, right? Like in the last 2 months, and Alana's helped me with one of them, right? I'm on my 5th coffee shop, right? Like the ministry or church is opening up their own coffee shop. Okay, well, like let's think about the legal structure for that. Okay? That's a whole nother, like tax thing is coffee shop. Oh, you just moved.
Sorry, I've just, yeah. Drinking from a fire hose, this is good.
Okay. Right, tax and donor issues. We won't spend a lot of time here. As you know, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 basically, in many ways, helped so many of us because it raised the standard deduction, right? It basically doubled the standard deduction. It took married filing jointly from $12-something to $24,000, right? But what that did is that reduced the number of people that do itemized deductions on their taxes, including charitable contributions. It had a negative impact about $13.1 billion into the charitable sector, right? Now, for those of us in faith ministry, that really hasn't moved the needle at all, right? Because people are not necessarily, they're not as motivated, believe it or not, people are not as motivated to giving to you for the deduction as you think they are, right? They're giving because of their heart, their faith, their belief in what you're doing, right? But I don't want to say it too loud because I'm a tax lawyer and then I'd be out of a job. The universal deduction, as you know, like through PPP, and then some of these acts that were passed, they included a standard deduction. Everybody could take $300 as a charitable deduction if they gave, right? Whether they use the standard deduction or not. And so there's effort to try to get that back into the law on a permanent basis. It was $600 for a married couple could deduct charitable deductions.
Can I ask you a question about that? And you may not know the answer to this because I think this is a tax question more. So when someone gives you a non-cash gift, how do you acknowledge that? For example, we had a lot of people give us stock. And my staff continues to want to tell those people, we got X dollars for it, so we're giving you credit for X dollars. And as a CPA, I'm thinking, no, the IRS says you just acknowledge the gift, you don't acknowledge the amount. It's X shares of stock on X date.
Yes.
What?
All right. Anybody have a pen? Okay. Write this down. Publication 1771.
What?
Publication 1771. It's an IRS publication on how you document charitable contributions, right? So just so you know, like I wake up thinking tax.
Oh, okay. Good.
Okay. I read the tax code riding my bike. Okay.
You're a nerd.
My stationary bike. Yes. So there's a couple pieces about that. Technically, you're correct. The receipting of contributions works this way, basically, right? If someone gives $75 or more, and right, they receive some benefit in return. In other words, you have a banquet, right, and the fair market value of that banquet is $20, right? To buy a ticket, it's $20. They give $80, right? Your receipt must say, right, thank you for a contribution of $80, right? In exchange for that contribution, you got, what did I say, $20? You got $20 a dinner in return, right? The deductible amount is the difference. No, you don't have to do the math for them, but you do have to say that. Anytime they give $250 or more, they have to have a receipt in order to deduct it on their taxes. So you don't have to give it to them, but come on, right? Like if you don't give it to them, they're going to be frustrated, right? So the requirement, the substantiation requirement is on the donor. But to serve them, you want to give them the substantiation. Now, on contributions of non-cash gifts, right? That's what we're talking about. If they give something that is valued at $2,500 or more, they have a form they have to fill out and submit to the IRS. Okay? And they give you a copy. If it's something that you sell, right, then when you sell it, so just if you want to, right? The first form is an 8283, right? If they give a contribution of property, $2,500 or more, they have to fill out an 8283. If you sell that, right, you fill out a form 8282, right, and you guys have exchanged copies. If your gift is $5,000, if what they give you, right, they give you Amazon stock. Now let's do a better one. They give you Berkshire Hathaway stock, right? Come on, Omaha, right? And they give you Berkshire Hathaway stock, right? Which is, I don't know what it is, 160,000, I don't know what it is. More than that. I bought the B for a while. I still have some B. But they give you this stock, right? They have to, and with stock, they can document it, right? Like, so they don't have to go out and get an appraisal. But let's say they give you a piece of property, right? They're like, give you, I've got this 40 acres over here. I'm giving it to your church, right? Then they have to get an appraisal. If it's $5,000 or more, they have to get a written appraisal, right? They attach that to 8283. They give you a copy. When you sell that property, you do the 8282, right? So you get the thresholds. So first off, it's 75 if they get something in exchange for the goods or service, right? In exchange, it's 250 for anything. They have to have that documentation, right? Then it's 2,500. Then it's 5,000. They have to have an appraisal. Okay.
So for stock, there is no appraisal because it's the selling price.
Yeah, it's fair. It's market. I mean, you want to save the record of that, whatever the market is on that day you sell it.
That's on them, not us.
Well, you have to do that with your 8282.
Okay. So we're supposed to be sending an 8282?
8282.
Okay.
To clarify though, whatever they sell it at doesn't matter.
Right.
Correct.
So that's why I'm thinking I don't have to tell the donor what we sold it for.
Right.
Except you're saying that I need to
On
send
your
it
8282.
82.
Yeah. You have to file them with the IRS too. Yep.
So my assumption is that everybody in this room is LCMS. LCMS on their website has what's called the Congregational Treasurer's Manual, and what he's been talking about for the last 5 minutes or so is summarized in one page in the Congregational Treasurer's Manual in Chapter 10. So, and then to go further, if you need help on some of this stuff, especially non-cash stuff, the LCMS Foundation exists to help you with these matters. Give them a call if you have questions
Okay.
related, and they will even help you liquidate stock, for example. They'll do it for you and do the receipting for you. So there's some tools out there that if you're aware of, you can utilize.
That's awesome. Is there a like a gift policy? In other words, what I recommend that churches and organizations have is you want to have a gift policy. In other words, you want to have something that says, when we receive stock, we're going to sell it. We're not going to hold it, right? Or if somebody, actually, first off, you start with, if we're offered a gift, it gets reviewed, other than cash, right? Unless it's an unmarked bills and, right? Cocaine dealer brings it, right? Then you want to think about it. Just so you know, when I was in seminary in Dallas, I worked for the Bank of Dallas for a while. And this was like the 80s. This was like cocaine crazy 80s in Dallas, Texas. We were anyway. And so there was, and back then, the cash reporting limit was $10,000. Now it's $15,000. Right? So, there were people who would bring in multiple $9,990 deposits. And it was just like you wear leather, plastic gloves, and just, it was just, you just knew there was cocaine all over that stuff, right? Okay. The story for another day is when I was running our drive-in through branch, and the FDIC pulled up, shut down. The bank was being sold, right? Then I actually worked for Bank of Dallas, or the people who bought it, and we bought 23 banks in 2 years in the Texas area, and I was on the recovery team. And we go into banks, and there'd be a 3-story bank, and all the employees had left because they knew that the bank had gone, had crashed. So craziness, right? All right, moving on from taxes. All right, harassment, bullying claims. Just passed law. Just passed that says that you can't have mandatory arbitration in harassment claims. So some of you may have policies that have mandatory dispute resolution, even under Christian Principles, Institute for Christian Conciliation, but harassment is just continues to be a potential liability exposure for churches. Records retention policy. How many of you, your church organization has a records retention policy? Record retention schedule. Like, how long do your employees keep their emails? Well, it's just another filing system, right? So that creates liability exposure, because you could have emails where your employee says something that wasn't necessarily your position, but they say something about another employee. That employee sues for wrongful termination. The first thing Alana's going to do, right, if she's suing your church, which she doesn't, but let's say that she is the attorney suing your church, right, or organization. The first thing she can do after she files a lawsuit is make a document request. Give me all of your emails, all of your document related to this. So she's going to get all that information, right? That's the liability. So states have a schedule of how long you have to keep certain records, right? How long do you have to keep your application? How long do you have to keep your SS4? How long do you have to keep all these different documents? Some of them are permanent, right? But some of them are 2 years or 4 years. Don't keep anything longer than you have to, for multiple reasons, right? It creates potential liability for you in those records. And secondly is, like, you need that space in that room in the basement, right? All that. So electronic records are fine, right? But you have to manage this. You need to have a policy and a schedule and a practice that implements it. Ministry, like, every presentation needs a picture of a buffalo, right?
Does it move?
This one does not.
You didn't know the other one did either.
I didn't know that. So this is at Custer State Park. It sounds good. Ministry, like, our firm has done more church mergers, right? More pastor resignations, right, than at any other time because of COVID. Burnout is happening, right? And so, that's a whole church leadership. There's a whole spiritual issue around that, right? Pastors feeling like they're all alone, right? But for us, like, it creates risk, right? Transitions are hard. A bit of knowledge and planning can ease the pain, right? Recognize that nonprofits are not owned by anyone, but unfortunately we run into founder syndrome, founder activity, where there's a great deal of control, right? And that can be very frustrating, right? Transitions, right? People leaving are hard. You may discover indiscretions, fraud, theft. Pay attention to warning signs. You have a responsibility, there's a duty of care. Understand that I had multiple situations in the last 2 years where, because nobody was in the office, that church employee or organization employee wasn't showing up every day, and they weren't allowed into the office. Somebody else, was finding something on their computer, was looking through their desk or their and they found things they wish they hadn't found, but they needed to find, right? And that can happen when somebody leaves, right? When a pastor leaves. So determine what succession planning means for your organization, right? At each level, and think about the risk that there is in not managing well, like how your employees are operating and who has control of what. Yes.
I was curious about, like, when you do uncover something, that there's like a financial indiscretion or a misappropriation of funds, and someone's suddenly gone, but they're not off they might take a call somewhere else, and what kind of maybe risk the old organization has to share that in like a reference check if they reach out. Because like on the school side, if there's sexual misconduct, there is a liability if they don't like tell the new school, right?
Yes.
If they like left suddenly before it could be investigated. I was just curious about
Yes.
being able to cover that.
Yeah, so the example you're giving is, let's say that somebody leaves and goes to another organization, and you find out that they had mismanaged things here, right?
Yeah.
So we're not necessarily talking about what your claim may be. You're talking about what obligation do you have,
To
or
the
what
new
can you
employer.
say, right? So your legal risk is defamation, right? It's saying something harmful, right, that harms somebody's reputation over there. The best defense to defamation is truth. So you can say, I would say what you know to be true, not what you think. You know, it looks like he was doing this. Well, no, you don't know that. Okay? So you want to do an internal investigation so you know what you know. Right? Like, write that down. Know what you know, right? So then on that basis, you can speak about what you know to be true, right? And so, but you don't have to share all that detail. In fact, you don't, like, it may be, that we discovered some things that we wouldn't hire him back, or, so you want to communicate in a healthy way, because we need that. Because that person may be applying at Jim's organization, right? So let's serve Jim in the church by being fair, honest, truthful, helpful, right? But the legal issue is defamation, so truth is your best defense. And then consistent with that is you want, I don't know how many of you have what are called whistleblower policies, but whistleblower policies are very helpful because they allow someone to know where do they go when they discover something, and it protects them from retaliation, right? Okay, we're about done. All right, so let's just tell you, some of you may be getting this, but the underbelly of wrong acts toward children is deep and ugly. Right? Like access on the internet to material, activity on the internet, soliciting kids, like in your organization, in your lives, I have no doubt that is happening to some of your children. Right? And it's just ugly. Right? And so you want to make sure that your organization is training, preparing people to make sure that it's a time to re-energize around child sexual abuse. Like your training, your activity, your attentiveness to it. Okay? We're done. Right? This is thinking about how to protect your property and assets. I was just in Chicago with a very large organization. They have multiple campuses across the United States. They have multiple activities going on, and they do it all in one corporation. All the assets are held by that corporation, and all the liabilities in that corporation. So if something happens on their campus in Los Angeles, Orange County, it could affect Florida, Wisconsin, Illinois. So think about, how do we separate risk, liability producing activity from our most valuable assets at our organization. All right, hey, love being with you. Somebody come up and start a list. If you want a copy of the PowerPoint, give me your name and email, as well as if you want the remote worker policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.